Kristin, thanks for doing this. I'm Dan Rundy. I'm hosting this conversation about Get Me Carlucci, written by Kristin Carlucci Weed. I knew Frank Carlucci. Your dad was a really amazing public servant. And I got to know him not through his service as Secretary of Defense, but as ambassador to Portugal. I had worked at USAID and I visited Portugal, and people spoke about your dad's public service as ambassador to Portugal in really, really respectful ways, both Portuguese and Americans, and with a deep sense of gratitude. And your dad was really involved with helping usher in democracy in Portugal. So I wanted to host this book event for you and I wanted to film it because I wanted to get it to a wider audience beyond sort of an in-person audience, because I thought your dad's public service was beyond defense, but also understood that the United States had various forms of influence and power, and he understood that we could use that for good to make the world a better place, and that public service was an honorable calling. And I think your dad's public service was amazing. So I wanted to host you because I knew your dad, and I knew of your dad's public service. So I was really excited when I knew that you'd written this book called Get Me Carlucci. So that's what prompted me to ask you to come to CSIS and do this.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here at CSIS today to discuss Get Me Carlucci. The book came out a couple of months ago, and I'm delighted to talk about it.
Why did you write the book?
So before my dad passed away in 2018, as you mentioned, my dad was a public servant at the end of the 20th century. But before he passed away, he wrote a small memoir that he gave to his family entitled A Life of Service. And it was written at my prompting because, as all of us, as we're nearing the ends of our life, I kind of thought, my children are not going to know this extraordinary life that he led. And my dad was a humble man who thought the kind of idea of writing a book was so self-aggrandizing that he would never do it. And so before he passed away, he wrote this book. In 2020, during COVID, as we were all kind of reflecting on our life goals and accomplishments and what mark we wanted to make in our own lives, I picked up this book entitled A Life of Service. And I was looking around at our current political situation, and I thought, what better use of my time than to take this book that my father had written about his life, this amazing life where he first was a Navy officer, then a Foreign Service officer, spent years in the Foreign Service, rose to the highest echelons of government service as Ambassador to Portugal, National Security Advisor, and then Secretary of Defense, and give that book to a wider audience. Use his book of public service as an example of leadership that we should all, and professionalism, that we should all aspire to, but that so often is kind of untold. So that's why I wrote it.
So Kristin, tell us about why you called it Get Me Carlucci.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. So that's kind of a two-part story. The original Get Me Carlucci came from a 1981 Washington Post article that was written when my dad was deputy director of the CIA during the Carter administration. So my father was a Republican, but he worked for 6 different presidents, both Democrats and Republicans. So the Washington Post posed this question that they asked why so many presidents, from Kennedy to Nixon to Ford to Reagan, then Reagan, to Carter, then Reagan, were asking, get me Carlucci, get me this guy. Who is this person that every single president kind of wants on their team? Because in 1981, after the Carter administration, he was almost unanimously confirmed into the Reagan administration as DepSecDef under Weinberger. So that whole idea of what what made him unique was what prompted the title. And then the first president to actually say, "Get me Carlucci," that's an interesting story, because that was President Kennedy. So my father was a Foreign Service officer stationed in Africa and Brazil. When he came back from the Congo, he says, this is a unique story. He says, "I was shuffling suitcases in Blair House." And
That was the job.
That was the job, right. And he had made it a point in the Congo to befriend lots of Congolese leaders. And so when one of the Congolese leaders had come to meet with President Kennedy, Cyril Adula, President Kennedy sat down at a table, and Cyril Adula said, "Où est Carlucci?" Which is, "Where is Carlucci?" in French. And Kennedy says, "Who the hell is Carlucci? And why isn't he here?" So word went down to find my father and bring him up. My father thought, "What am I doing in the White House?" And that was the first. He was asked to translate for Adula to the president. And that was the first but not last of his interactions with presidents of the United States.
Okay, so let's talk about, so he spoke French and Portuguese.
Yeah, so he ended up by his death speaking something like 8 different languages.
Really?
Swahili, yeah, because he found it, he'd said he could speak it, but he couldn't write it. So he would say that when he would go in country, he found it very important to be able to speak the language. And there's an amazing story in the book. I urge you all to go buy it.
Where can you go buy the book, by the way?
You can find it on Amazon, or I'll be selling them later.
Okay, exactly. And so the title is, so it's very important. Franklin says you want to always say the title 7 times. So the title is Get Me Carlucci.
Get Me Carlucci.
That's right, Get Me Carlucci. So, okay, so tell me the story about the languages.
So I think when he was a young person being sent into these places, first he was sent to South Africa, then the Congo, then Zanzibar. He learned that it was important to be able to speak the language of the country. And there's a great story when he was sent to Zanzibar that he was sent to this area where he didn't understand what everybody was saying. And what they ended up saying was, they were pointing at him and saying, "There's the enemy." And they were saying it in Swahili. And he said,
God.
Right then and there, I learned that learning Swahili was imperative. And so he learned Swahili when he was in Zanzibar. And when he went to talk to the leadership in Zanzibar, and he could speak Swahili, he was standing next to the Soviet minister. And the leader in Zanzibar turned to the Soviet minister and said, "Why can't you speak Swahili?" So I think that was an example of how he kind of earned his diplomatic chops at a young age, and would go on to later apply those kind of skills in Washington.
Let me talk about in Congo and the case of Zanzibar as well. Like, he wasn't on the cocktail circuit.
No.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so when he arrived in the Congo, it was 15 days before independence. So the Belgians were swiftly decolonizing the Congo. And at such a rapid pace that very few Congolese were educated, and kind of chaos was ensuing during that period. So if you can imagine, my father was kind of a small in stature. I mean, you met him.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, blue-eyed, blonde, short-cut blonde hair.
Always very athletic,
Very athletic, yes. And he thought the best thing to do would not to be go around in an embassy car, because that wouldn't get him very good access. So he rented a car and got a press pass, because back then the press could travel around in a much easier way than anybody that worked from the American embassy. So he saddled up to the bar in the parliament and made friends with everybody around. And I think during that period really kind of earned the trust of people around him.
He was stabbed.
He was
Tell us
stabbed.
about that.
Yeah, so he had some remarkable stories, but as you can imagine, the Congo and newly independent Congo, there's a story where he was sent to pick up some American diplomats from the airport. And he's in a car with the driver, and he's sitting in the back with 2 American diplomats. And the driver is driving very quickly, too quickly. And he asks the driver to slow down repeatedly, because he knows that in the Congo, as in, a lot of the third world countries at the time, if somebody gets hit, there is a mob. Villagers will often try to kill the driver in retribution, and that's exactly what happened. So the driver hit a Congolese person, and immediately a mob starts forming next to the car. And my father decides to get out of the car and pull them and go towards the Congolese gentleman that's killed, in order to pull the mob away from the car. And in the ensuing chaos, he gets stabbed in the back. He's lucky that a bus drives by and he's able to get on the bus, and that saves his life. And mine too. So now I exist, we all exist. So, but yeah, I think that kind of that story frames that time period, and those situations where he's just kind of trying to navigate
a chaotic situation.
And during that period, he kind of earns this reputation as a maverick Foreign Service officer, kind of,
which is sort of seen, not necessarily welcomed by everybody in the Foreign Service.
It is not.
But he was someone who was willing to take calculated risks.
Yes.
Is that a way to describe it?
I think it is. I learned recently, while I was doing research for this book, I was listening to a podcast, and I learned this word, a polyglot, somebody that can speak, polyglot, somebody that can speak multiple languages. And they were arguing that anybody could be a polyglot, but the difference between a polyglot and somebody that just speaks one language or no languages is you have to be more of a risk taker. You have to be willing to be wrong when you're speaking in a different country, as opposed to
playing it safe.
And I thought, isn't that perfect? Isn't kind of that the perfect definition of, I think, who he was, is being able to take a little bit of risk, wanting to be able to communicate with people, even if what he's saying isn't always correct, but rather than being perfect and playing in the lane that you're giving.
So let me just press on that for a second. So 8 languages.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, okay, how many gringos do you know?
Yeah, not many.
Not many. I speak Spanish, and I'm really proud of that, and that's like my superpower. My wife speaks 4, and I'm super impressed that my wife speaks 4. One of my kids is on his 4th, and that's like a super stretch thing, and it's highly unusual for an American to speak 2, 3, or 4. I know one person, and she's an affiliate here, she speaks 7.
Yeah.
And whenever I see her, I said, "You've had me at 7 languages." The fact that your dad spoke 8 languages. Okay,
I'll have to think.
But I'm going with más o menos 7 or 8. That's a lot.
It's a lot.
So if I look up the word polyglot in the dictionary, your father was totally a polyglot, among many other wonderful things to say about him. But I think absolutely polyglot. But I think also, think about someone of his generation to have had that sort of international experience and being able to be effective in lots of international, it wasn't being effective in Paris, this was being effective in Congo, or being effective in Zanzibar.
In fact, he didn't want to go to...
He didn't want to be on the cocktail circuit.
He did not want to do that. When they threatened to send him there, he had been expelled from Zanzibar. And so when they threatened to send him to be transportation officer in Italy, he thought that was the worst.
That was like a fate worse than death.
Yes, he didn't want to do that.
Did your dad, so I wrote a book, as you know, this isn't about my book, but I wrote a book about American soft power in this new age of great power competition. And the book that I am most impacted by was a book called The Ugly American. Have you ever come across that book?
I haven't.
Okay, and I bet your father read it. But your father's the response to that. The book came out in 1958 and said, we don't have enough multilingual diplomats willing to take risks, go out into the field, meet lots of people. Your father's like the exception that proved the rule at the time. We didn't have enough people like your dad.
Yeah.
And it was not even necessarily rewarded, or it was sort of kind of frowned upon, him taking those sorts of risks at the State Department at the time. It was like, well, it's not totally fair to say, well, all those folks were comfortable doing the cocktail circuit, but there was a little bit of a default to sort of talk to sort of the elites. And he didn't just speak to elites, right?
That's right. I think that was also which defined him, is that he didn't like that idea of only just speaking to elites. He would talk to everybody who was around him. And so that was characteristic. And plus, he loved doing things like playing tennis. And he was an avid sports person. And so he would look to go jogging, or, so in order to do those things, he was outside. And
your dad wasn't an elitist. He went to Princeton, and he spoke 8 languages. He went to Harvard Business School, but he wasn't, I met him, he was not an elitist. And tell him a little bit about your dad's early childhood, because I think that also, allowed him to kind of interface with people from all sorts of backgrounds.
Yeah, no, he grew up in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, so Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area, which is Pennsylvania area. And his grandfather came over from Italy. He was a stonemason. And set up his business there. And by the time my dad came around, he had a successful business, and his father was an insurance salesman. So my
middle class,
very middle class, and he was the first in his family to go to some place like Princeton, which seemed like extraordinary,
far away.
Yeah. So, but his whole life had this very kind of very monotone, he was not hoity-toity at all. Very humble look at the world. In fact, my mom still lives in the same house they lived in 40 years ago when I was born. So.
And when your dad went into the Foreign Service, your grandfather was not super happy about it.
No, he actually thought he was disappointed. He came around to it once he found out he was going to be pretty successful, but he thought anything that was not in the business world was not a reputable career choice. He didn't really have any idea that you could be in government and be successful.
Did you know your grandfather?
I didn't. Not well. I hadn't met him when I was a child.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about Congo, and I was going to ask, who is Frank Carlucci? Who the hell is Frank Carlucci? Kennedy famously says this. This is something I had heard about before your book. I'd read about this. So talk about anything else you want to talk about in terms of his service in Zanzibar, because I'm super interested in sort of all, and we could talk about Secretary of Defense, because I think a lot of folks, when you do book events, people want to talk to you about Secretary of Defense, but I want to talk about his earlier service, because I'm super interested in that, and what it brought me to call you and say, oh my gosh, you got to come do this. So tell me about Zanzibar.
Yeah, so he spent a short period of time in Zanzibar. He was sent there to help reset up this NASA tracking station. So he was one of very few Americans there at the time. So I think there was just him and one other person at the time. So I think the story there was, it was very, very tense, and it was overrun by Soviet influence and Chinese influence there. And he ended up getting kicked out of the country because of something he had said on a telegram.
On a telephone call or something.
Yeah.
And it was later, I think your father tried to piece it together later, and it was seen as like a Russian disinformation operation.
That's
Is that a way to describe it?
Yes.
Yeah. So they kind of misconstrued or took out of context what he said and said, well,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah,
and so we see that now.
We see it now.
We see that now.
Yeah.
So he was a victim of a Russian disinformation operation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because he was one of the few Americans there, and the Russians really wanted them out.
How did he get to Brazil?
So he had, the way he tells the story is, again, he was kicked out of Zanzibar and put back in the State Department here in Washington, D.C.
Which I'm thrilled he was not thrilled about.
No, he wasn't. And he was told he was going to go to be a transportation officer in Italy. He didn't like that job. So he was offered a job. He was offered a job in Brazil, to work at the embassy in Brazil. He kind of talked, he says, I talked my way into it. I said the right words. I said I went to the right school.
Which at the time, that kind of stuff still mattered?
I think at the time, that kind of stuff still mattered. And his term in Brazil, it was really about, that period of time in Brazil was less adventurous for him, but it was more about his managerial skills. That period in Brazil is kind of, he talks about streamlining how many Americans were at the embassy there, which means...
Yeah, the ambassador asked him to do some dirty work.
Yes. So he had to, he sent people back to their original post in the State Department. There was too many Americans there, so he was firing people there, which... I don't know. I like to think that he learned some skills and diplomacy on how to do that. That's exactly what he did.
And he sort of developed a reputation for sort of taking hard decisions.
That's right.
As a result of that. And that carried over later.
That's right. So I think he learned this reputation of being tough guy Carlucci. That caught the attention of Nixon later on.
He took Vice President Nixon around Brazil?
He did.
Tell us about that.
So he took him around and showed him the embassy there.
Brasilia.
Yes.
What year would have this been?
Oh, goodness. 19, you're going to catch me. I don't
59?
No, later.
Okay, it was later then. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so Nixon was vice president from... Was he president at the time? Okay, so he was vice president until 61. So he made a famous trip 1959 to Venezuela, 1958 to Venezuela. Maybe it was that trip. Maybe it was that. When did he enter the Foreign Service? I'm trying to remember.
So it would have been, he was in the Congo in 1960. He had left the Congo
and
in 1960.
then he was in Brazil later?
And he was in Brazil later.
So maybe he was, maybe it was okay, so we'll have to figure that out. But but
interestingly enough, you were the first interview who was asked me about Brazil.
There you go. Well, I'm Brazil curious. If you ask me what I would like as if a genie came out of a bottle, this is the truth, and several people know this. If I could learn Brazilian Portuguese, that would be a life goal.
Okay.
So the fact that your dad spoke straight up Portuguese is something I really admire. Mm-hmm. So I'm very curious about Brazil, really interested in the country. I'm a student of Brazil. I've been there a number of times, but so I'm always curious about the country of Brazil. Okay, but I think, so then he serves in Brazil. How does he get to Portugal, which is what is how I know most about your father, because I want to spend some time talking about Portugal.
Sure. So he serves in Brazil and then is asked to we'll jump ahead a little bit, but he's asked to come back and serve in a number of domestic policy posts here in Washington, D.C. He serves at OEO, OMB, and HEW. Starts to understand the domestic arena here. And during that time, the Cold War is heating up even further than it already has overseas. And the little country of Portugal is becoming kind of a hot spot. So Kissinger, and this is now the Ford administration, decides that it would be a great idea to send tough guy Carlucci, who is now no longer in the Foreign Service, he's a civil servant, and send him over to be ambassador to Portugal. So this is the mid-1970s. It is U.S. policy at the time, kind of their belief that Portugal is going to be communist. It's not an incorrect assumption. The Portuguese, at the time, their leadership is lots of communist sympathizers, and Portugal is a part of NATO. So there's a great fear.
That we're going to lose a NATO country.
We are going to lose a NATO country. That's right. So they decide to send my father over there, and he lands at the airport, and he's the first American ambassador to Portugal that speaks the language.
Ever.
God
almighty.
So he starts...
1974. We probably had diplomatic relations at that time for 150 years, and it's the first in 150 years.
Yeah.
God almighty.
So we start speaking Portuguese to the press there, who have left-leaning tendencies. And I think he takes the same tactic that he did in the Foreign Service, that he starts getting to know everybody, including his Secret Service, the people he wants to play tennis with, the leadership of the country. And he comes to the realization, his own assessment, that the U.S. policy on Portugal is not correct. That he thinks that in due course, that the Portuguese will choose a path to democracy. This is because that the Portuguese are a naturally kind of conservative country, a naturally Catholic country, a rural country, and he starts to develop a close friendship with Mário Soares, who goes on to become the first democratically elected prime minister of Portugal.
And you say he's center-left, but he's not a communist.
That's right, socialist.
Let me just jump in for a second. So just a little bit of paint a picture about Portugal. I'm going to mangle this slightly, but so there was a 30-year dictatorship, Salazar.
Correct.
There's a coup or something.
Right.
Maybe in 1974. Mm-hmm. There was an ambassador before your dad, mm-hmm. and he is on a boat or something.
He's on a trip, I believe, to the Azores, actually, but yeah.
But with like the whole embassy team or something.
Yes.
And so they're kind of, I'm not going to say they're kind of asleep at the switch, but I'm going to kind of say they were kind of asleep at the switch.
Well, there's this sentiment, actually, and I had talked to a foreign service officer that was there before and during my father's tenure, that there was this sense, because of this, the way that Portugal is, that there's the embassy there is kind of a sleepy little outpost where nothing really happens, and they develop this sense of, which I was not familiar with this term, of localitis.
Clientitis and localitis.
Yes.
Going native.
Right.
Okay, so there's the coup, there's sort of this ferment. They join NATO and are part of the Marshall, I believe we're part of the Marshall Plan. But we have there's a sort of new rules of the game in the country that are being set. Henry Kissinger and the establishment thinking in Washington is this is going to go commie, mm-hmm. right? Isn't that basic? Henry Kissinger believed
100%.
firmly that it was going to go communist.
Yep.
So everyone in Washington is like, okay, we're going to send you, this is going to be a super tough job because we think it's going commie. And we think the opposition, the people you're going to deal with, they're communists.
Right.
Is that fair?
That's 100% right.
Okay. All right. So he goes and takes a different view. So he goes and gets really smart about the country.
Right.
Speaks to everybody. Mm-hmm. Makes his own assessment. Says the establishment view in Washington is wrong.
Right.
Henry Kissinger, the most important foreign policy person of his age, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, you're wrong.
Right.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
So is that a risky position? That's taking a little bit of a risk.
It's taking
right? Can we agree?
Bit of a risk. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, 100%.
So he 100% took a risk, saying, "Sir, I respectfully disagree."
Right.
Correct?
Yes.
And so that wasn't necessarily like a popular position. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
So I think, and I think what he wanted at the time is the U.S. was verbalizing strongly how its position loudly, and he wanted them not to do that.
They like shut up, quiet.
That's right.
Okay. So Kissinger and others they're going commie. This is almost a write-off.
Yeah.
But it's more than just Portugal. So at the time, Franco's about to die next door in Spain, mm-hmm. right? So I lived in Spain for a long time. It's not really monetizable, but I'm somewhat of a student of Spanish 20th century history. So you didn't know this,
no,
but I got knighted by the government of Spain. So I'm a friend of Spain's. So what happens in Portugal is sort of, I'm going to call it foreshadows what's going to happen. So if things go good in Portugal, the Spanish can point to that and say, well, it isn't going commie. We can afford to have a democracy here. We don't need to have a right-wing military dictatorship. We can afford to take some political risks and so allow opposition to happen. So it's not just about what's happening in Portugal that matters. It matters largely for the Iberian Peninsula, but also for saying, at the time, we were making a lot of hard choices around the world, saying we're going to back a lot of thug regimes because there are thugs, right? And at this time, we kind of had 30 years of the Cold War saying, well, maybe, people aren't going to be super psyched if we just have thug regimes. And so how are we going to enable democracy to happen and make sure that people like democracy or not like having a communist, right? Is that all fair?
Yeah.
Okay. So the stakes were pretty high, and
Yeah.
it wasn't just about Portugal.
Right.
Okay, so he takes a different view. There's an established view. I'm not going to call it intellectually lazy view, but perhaps an uninformed view. But he informs himself. He speaks Portuguese,
Right.
goes all over the country,
Right.
speaks to priests,
Yes.
speak to communists, speak to socialists,
Right.
speak to the military, speaks to everybody.
Right.
And his assessment is different. So what does he recommend? What does he say? And what is the recommendation? And what role does the United States play? Because I think there's because I think there's a role for the United States, and obviously the protagonists are the Portuguese themselves.
Right. No, I think he provides his own support to Mario Suarez and his becoming the new democratically elected prime minister. I think he wants the Portuguese military to become more integrated with NATO. I think that's important. And then he encourages financial
He provides assistance, enables assistance.
Enable assistance to the Portuguese economy.
Both from the U.S. government as well as maybe from the IMF, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's a moment where somebody removes security around the embassy.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So it's soon after he arrives. There is another leader in Portugal that threatens his life, and
Threatens your dad's life.
yes.
Okay. Well,
And removes security around the embassy. And my father calls him and says, "What do you think you're doing? You know, you're removing the security of the American ambassador." And they have a confrontation, a conversation on the phone. And he said, "Oh, okay." And he backs down. And
restores the security.
And restores the security.
Okay. So what happens? So who is Mario Suarez and what happens?
Yeah, so, there's a wonderful, if you can imagine the residence where the ambassador lives in Lisbon, this residence, it has multiple stories. It's kind of like a beautiful townhouse in Lisbon. The top story of this townhouse is now it's kind of an enclosed area, but back then it was where people hung their laundry. It was kind of open air. My father decided that would be the perfect place for meetings with leadership. And so he would invite Mario Suarez to have meetings at the top of the residence because the views of the river, the Tagus River, were superb. So they would sit up there and have meetings about the future of Portugal and Portuguese-American relations. And to this day, there's a plaque in that room dedicated to that friendship that formed during that period.
When did Suarez become prime minister or president of Portugal?
1978, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So he, in essence, helped change the thinking in Washington about what was going to happen in Portugal and kind of shifts U.S. policy to support. I mean, we were supporting actors in somebody else's movie, right? We were basically able to be productive, good supportive actors in somebody else's movie.
Exactly.
Is that a way to describe it?
Yes. I think that's what he would say. Every time this question was asked to him, he said it was not us, it was the Portuguese that they enabled their own democratic transition. We were there to support them. And I think my father gave the Portuguese the spirit and the support of the United States.
Okay, that's really, really important. Okay, so the reason I want to talk about something that may seem a little niche-y about Portugal, which is, so when I met your dad, I've met your father, I don't know, maybe a half a dozen times, always at like the tennis club in McLean. I introduced my two oldest children to him. I said to him, I know a lot about this institution. I'm really interested in the Luso-American Foundation. I'm hoping you'll speak there, hopefully.
Yes, the plan is to speak there in May.
So it's across the street from the ambassador's residence.
That's right.
It's a super beautiful neighborhood in Lisbon. The ambassador's residence is very beautiful. And what's it called now?
Casa Carlucci.
Right.
Yes.
Good. And then across the street is Luso-American Foundation. So when I spoke to your father about it, he said, well, I remember negotiating with Mara Suarez that we paid rent on the Azores U.S. military air base in the Azores, and we negotiated that some of the money would go to a fund which would be used to deepen U.S.-Portuguese relationships in all sorts of ways. We can figure it out later. He didn't say that, I'm putting words in his mouth. But that, because what interested me, so I had a career at AID for a time. I was in the Bush administration at AID. I worked at the World Bank for a while. I'm interested in non-military forms of American power. And so that's also why I'm spending so much time on his non-Secretary of Defense life. And what happens to a country when they stop needing to be a developing country? So the kinds of things your dad enabled with sort of this financial support, kind of putting Portugal on a path to joining the European Union sometimes later. There's a point at some point where we sort of like, what do we do? Do we send a country a telegram saying, hey, congratulations, we don't need foreign aid anymore, you're a real country now, or whatever it is, right? Like, we don't have a clever way or an elegant way of kind of creating lasting legacy ties or partnership ties. So the Luso-American Foundation is one of a handful of examples in the world where we've done that correctly or pretty close to correctly. You could quibble and say, well, I don't like the board arrangement, or donor intent isn't exactly what we would like, but más o menos it's sort of it's pretty close to the bullseye. We don't have a lot of examples of this. And so as you have countries reach what would be described in international development as like middle income status, we don't have ways to do this. And so I wrote a report maybe more than 10 years ago looking at a series of countries that were reaching or had achieved middle income status, and like, well, what were we going to do when we stopped having a chicken or beef foreign aid program? And so one of the models is the Luso-American Foundation. This was something your dad set up. And so I think it's really cool that you're going to speak at the Luso-American Foundation. Again, this is something that your dad helped create more than 35 years ago, more than 40 years ago.
That is pretty unique and cool.
Yeah,
I like that.
Cool. So, okay, so that's that. So Portugal is what brought me to this conversation. As you can see, we wanted to talk about that. Okay, so after serving in Portugal, what did your dad do?
I also want to mention, just on a personal note,
sure.
Portugal is where my parents got married. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, so my mom went to Portugal with my father, and it was my father's second marriage, so they had to go to the Rock of Gibraltar to get married.
Oh my goodness.
So, just as a side note.
As a side note. Okay, so Portugal.
Yes.
So what happens after he serves in Portugal? Because he says, in your book, you say, well, he felt like he'd kind of he'd kind of made a contribution, and he felt like it was time for him to do something else.
Yeah. So he didn't want to develop localitis, get too involved in, he felt like he was very involved in Portuguese politics, so he needed to leave and go back to DC. By then it was the Carter administration. He was first offered a job at the State Department, or somebody was thinking he'd be at the State Department, and he said, well, I'm a Republican. Do you think they'd actually nominate me for a job at the State Department? They thought, well, maybe not. So how about deputy director of the agency under Stansfield Turner? So
the agency meaning the CIA.
The CIA.
Okay.
Under Stansfield Turner. So he stayed there for 2 years. Under the Carter administration. So.
And then what happened?
So then Reagan's elected, and he moves over to be DepSecDef, Deputy Secretary of Defense, under Weinberger, who he had worked with previously in that domestic agency stint that I talked about at OEO, OMB, and HEW. HEW turned into HHS. That's what we kind of know as HHS.
So let me just stop you there and just say, okay, so I'm going to just name some people who I know who they are. Some of the people in television land may not know who all these folks are. So who who is Cap Weinberger? Who is, who's Donald Rumsfeld in terms of relation to your dad? Who's Colin Powell in relation to your dad? Let's first start with Weinberger. How did he meet Weinberger, and what was his relationship with Cap Weinberger?
I believe, because I had never asked my dad this directly, but I believe they originally met when Cap Weinberger was working with then Governor Reagan, and then they worked together at OMB, OEO, and HEW. And my dad became kind of Casper Weinberger, known as Cap Weinberger's number two. And they developed a really good, close working relationship. And then when Cap Weinberger went over to become Ronald Reagan's very long-standing Secretary of Defense, he asked my father to go along with him
to be his deputy.
At the time, my father had served in public service for his entire career, and wanted to leave actually and go make some money in the private sector because he thought, I don't have any money. But he said, no, I'll stay with you for 2 years. And it's interesting because, especially with Cap Weinberger would also, he was a very intelligent man, but oftentimes when he would take a position publicly, he wouldn't moderate that position. There were very few people that could get him to change his mind. But my father, being, I think, a diplomat at his heart, and often having this way of also being he was a pragmatist, would be able to get Cap to change his mind on lots of positions that he felt needed changing.
Okay, so who's Donald Rumsfeld vis-a-vis your dad?
So Don Rumsfeld and my father went to Princeton together. They were wrestling. They were on the same wrestling team at Princeton. And they were friends. And their paths crossed quite a few times in Washington. In fact, Don Rumsfeld was the one that pulled my dad out of the Foreign Service and into OEO.
What's OEO? Sorry.
The Office of Economic Opportunity in Washington, D.C. And at the time, my dad said, I don't know a damn thing about poverty, because OEO was the organization,
the domestic anti-poverty agency.
Anti-poverty agency.
Okay, who was? Tell us about your dad's relationship with Colin Powell.
Yeah, so that was the one that's probably it's the one that's most well known, or maybe not, is probably the most significant. So Colin was my father's military assistant when he was Deputy Secretary of Defense. That's kind of when their relationship began. And then when my father was asked to be Reagan's national security advisor, because he was, and he would tell this story, he was asked, this was after Iran-Contra, he was pulled in, my father was pulled in to fix the situation, fix the National Security Council after Iran-Contra. He told the president, there's only one person I want with me, and that was Colin Powell. At the time, Colin was serving in Germany, so he called Colin and said, I need you here to come. I need you to come with me to serve as my number two. And Colin said, no, thank you. I'm really happy serving here in Germany. And
it's going to be disruptive to my family to move. It's going to hurt my career as an Army officer.
Yes.
Right?
And he would say later, yeah, Frank, you're destroying my career. Like, I like my career as an Army officer. And he said, in order to get me to move, I'm going to need a call from the president. And so later that evening, he got a call from President Reagan saying,
I need you to come and be my deputy national security advisor.
I need you to come and be, Frank's deputy national security advisor. So
that's pretty impressive.
I think later on in life, they, developed a strong rapport.
They were really close.
Yeah.
And you were really close to Secretary Powell.
Well, there's a funny story, is that he was my babysitter, and like when I was a small child and in the Pentagon, he was asked to be my babysitter. But yeah, and he would go on to eulogize my father at his funeral, and I spoke to him a little bit before he died about this book.
Okay, who is Admiral William Crowe?
So he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs when my father was SecDef. I think, my father thought extremely highly of him. And in fact, I marked it on here because I thought, what better words than, to hear his words. He said, Crowe, my father remembered Crowe as a wonderful man, a great sense of humor, very easy to work with, commands a lot of respect from the services. He didn't have the public flair of Colin Powell, but he was very solid, serious man who did not hesitate to step up to the difficult jobs. So I thought that was...
It's great. Okay, so can you just talk a little bit about this? So this book, we're gonna try and make sure we get to our 7 times we say this. So it's Get Me Carlucci by Kristin Carlucci Weed.
Right.
So this is sort of, you're kind of co-authoring this with your dad. Could you just explain a little bit about, there was like a first memoir. You're kind of like your dad's, I'm not gonna say, you're kind of like collaborator, contextualizer. Is that a way to describe it?
Right. So I tried to keep his original.
So he had like a memoir.
He had a memoir, and rather than scrapping the original memoir, I kept it because he had a dry sense of humor that I couldn't replicate. And so, I kept pieces of his storytelling in this book. And so when I went to actually put it together, my publisher said, well, there's 2 authors to this book. And I said, there are 2 authors to this book.
There are 2 authors to this book.
It's not just me. So although he has since passed away, he absolutely co-authored this book. And so I'm the narrator, but there's a lot of, and I provide a lot of historical context, and I provide a lot of history that's also mine. But there's, it's a lot of his storytelling and his verbiage. Like there's exact quotes of his original memoir in this book.
Yeah, I think I bought it retail. I know you gave me a copy, but I think I did buy a copy, right? I bought a copy. I did buy a copy. You sure buy a copy? Yeah, thank you. I think I was fishing for, can I have an advance copy? But I did go out and buy actually one. But I encourage folks to go out and buy this book. So I enjoyed it a lot. It's an easy read. It's not necessarily, it's accessible to folks who don't know the period.
Yeah.
It's very personal. But not too personal, right? It's personal, but so I just think it's really great. Is there 1 or 2 other people that were significant kind of personal / professional relationships you want to talk about? Those are the ones that kind of struck me and I wanted to just ask you about.
I mean, his family.
I was going to say, can we talk about that? Let's talk about his family. So there's throughout the book.
Yeah.
Throughout the book, there's lots of sort of family anecdotes about your brother, mm-hmm. your older brother. Mm-hmm. I don't know all. There are 4 of you.
No, I have a older half sister, older half brother, myself, my mom. So yeah.
Okay, so you're the only. You're okay. All right. So there's 3. There's 3 siblings.
Mm-hmm.
3. Okay. Mm-hmm. So talk about. So you intersperse a number of your own personal anecdotes. You visited Asia.
Right.
I think you visited the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. You spent some time as a kid at the Pentagon, maybe at the White House. Talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I think I tried to give a perspective of who he was as a father with this, these giant jobs, and growing up in that. And what I really want to get across is I've gotten asked a couple of times what it felt like, and it didn't feel like anything, with the exception of going to some wild places like the Soviet Union.
But you're like 6 or 8 or 7, yes. So you're kind of knowing this is kind of weird, but you're not totally, you're sort of aware this is unusual, but it's not.
Right, but he doesn't make it unusual. So I think that's like his humility. And his empathy and his just groundedness in his personality, which translates through to, I think, his jobs, is what I really wanted to kind of try to get across. And, he used to take the trash every Sunday. We live my mom and father lived at the end of a long street, so the trash truck couldn't come all the way down. So he would put the trash in his car and drive it to the local elementary school. It just says...
There was some person who would pick up the trash and you got to know your dad.
Yes, well, he'd pick it up out of the car and got to know him.
But
so
like...
that kind of speaks to the type of person that he was, and the type of person that I feel like we sometimes lack in our public discourse today, like that quiet humility, the public servant attitude, and that reverence for that type of person.
Okay, Steve Hadley, who is like one of the people I most admire in Washington, did a blurb for your book, which I think was really nice. Secretary Carlucci represented the best of Washington, and this book captures in his own words the legacy of great foreign policy and national security accomplishment he left behind. So I know you wanted to write this book, you know, as like a personal memoir, but I think there was like, can we just talk a little bit about this issue of public service and your dad's legacy and sort of what, you know, I think there were some things in addition to sort of memorializing your dad for your kids. There's something larger you wanted people to take away from this.
Yeah, there was a quote from, I think, Cap in the book that said, and it was from a long time ago, but it struck me as I was writing it, said, you know, Frank is the consummate public servant, and maybe even said civil servants, and we have too few of them today, and they're too easy targets. And that struck me as that, yes, and this is an example of why I feel like serving the public good in the way he did, from the Navy to, and there's so many ways to do it, but the Navy, the Foreign Service, the Civil Service, and transcending the idea of politics, and to be able to do that is a story worth telling and worth reflecting on, especially in the polarized...
It's a more scratchy age, to put it mildly.
Yes, in the polarized environment that we live in today. And I don't have the answers, you know, I don't know if somebody like that could transcend the politics of today and live that life, but I do think that his example is one that at least we can learn about and potentially aspire to.
So I'm thinking of people in the Congress today that I admire, and there are people in the Congress I admire, both in the Republican and the Democratic Party. I'm thinking, okay, it'd be harder today. Unfortunately, much harder today. Mm-hmm. Okay. I do want to we haven't spent a lot of time talking about his service as Secretary of Defense. One of the things he did, which Dr. John Henry, who's our president, was also Deputy Secretary of Defense, and if he was here, he'd want to talk about this, is the BRAC.
Yeah.
What is the BRAC?
The base.
And how did he come up with it? What was this? He got this idea from somebody else, and talk about it. Yeah, it's so interesting.
It is interesting, and I think it's something that people still, at least people in the defense community still know about today. And it's an example of kind of one of these bipartisan initiatives that kind of he came up with. The Base Realignment and Closure Commission. You know, it's the end of the Cold War, and my father really had this idea that there's lots of waste. You know, there's a lot of wasteful spending, and he didn't want to cut military pay, which, as a military wife myself, I appreciate. But a lot of the bases and infrastructure, which I've also witnessed personally, are superfluous and unusable. But it's very difficult to achieve that because a lot of these bases are congressmen's pet projects, or
it's the major employer in my district.
In a district, right? So he had this idea, and I do believe it was originally a congressman's idea, but
I think Dick Armey had an idea, something similar, but I think your dad took it and made it better.
Yeah, he made it into an independent commission in order to close bases. And he made it into an up or down vote, which was kind of the...
So there's here's 10, this independent commission has said these 10 up or down. You can't say, oh, save this one, save that one.
Yep.
And so there were at least 3 or 4, we had to do this at the end of the Cold War. This was part of the so-called peace dividend.
Right.
And so I'm going to guess I can't remember if there were 3 or 4 rounds of this, but it was his idea.
Right.
And it's an important, in the defense world, it's a big deal.
It is a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, so the book is called Get Me Carlucci.
That's right.
The author is
Thanks again.
Kristin Carlucci Weed.
Yep.
You can get it on Amazon.
You can.
I bought it retail. You should buy it retail too. And if you like it, I'm sure you'd appreciate a positive review on Amazon if you liked it.
Amazon or Goodreads, yep.
Amazon or Goodreads,
Yep.
right? Okay. So thanks for doing this today.
Thanks so much, Dan. This was
You're
a pleasure.
welcome. You're welcome. Thanks. You're selling books
Thanks so
here,
much,
so if
guys.
people want to buy books, they can buy some in the back.
I'll sign and sell some books in the back.
Okay, awesome. Please join me in thanking Kristin Carlucci Weed.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.